Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second part two of the Solar Electric Investment Analysis Web Seminar Series, where we're going to cover in detail how to perform a economic analysis for behind-the-meter solar arrays. And the two presenters today are going to be myself, John Hay from University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and Eric Romick from Ohio State University. Both of us do extension work in our respective states. And focus quite a lot on energy systems at the farm, business, and residential level. A lot of examples we're going to give throughout this web seminar are going to be farm examples because that's kind of our core audience. But these examples also work very well with businesses and can be extended to the same concepts can be extended to residential systems as well. So depending on who you interact with, this should work well. This is the second part in our four-part series. We're going to cover system costs and financial parameters today. We're going to have part three is going to be again a kind of more of a lecture part, and then part four we're going to spend the entire day working on simulations and case studies and looking at the model and how to use the model. And I will remind you, and I send it out on email, that we also are having a discussion, kind of an office hours discussion time in the early afternoon of the April the 8th. And so if you've got a system that you want to model or you want to practice using the model, that would be a great time to do it. Get into that, make some mistakes, ask us questions, and we'll help troubleshoot some of those things. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about design characteristics of solar, so you have some ideas on how design and some of those parameters influence the solar production. And then Eric's going to spend some time on system cost, in particular the cost of the system as you purchase it, ongoing costs, and then some of the financial metrics that we're going to need to try to interpret the results of the model. We're going to have a similar closing discussion like we did on Tuesday, and we have some new questions for you for that. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about the design impact of solar. If you have questions, please type them into the chat box, and Eric will kind of keep track of those and make sure that we don't miss any, and answer them if they're simple, and we'll answer them for everybody if that's appropriate. Not all systems are created equal. Essentially, you put a system, one system faces west, one faces south, they're going to be different in production because of just the nature of the sun's movement across the sky. So some of the things that we're going to touch on here, ground mount versus roof mount. And so you can see we have two different systems here. One's mounted on a roof, one's mounted on the ground. And obviously, we can also notice that the tilt is different. In this case, both are facing due south, but one has a tilt that's pretty low, maybe 15 degrees, while another has a tilt that is closer to optimum at about 35 degrees. There's other types of systems like tracking systems that track the sun. This one has a little monitor right up at the top, and it simply just faces the sun at any given time of day. Yet this one also is having some pretty substantial reductions in production due to the shade. So you can see some pretty significant shading there. The panels that have shading are producing substantially less, maybe not completely off, but substantially less than ones that don't have shade. And so essentially, there's only about 3 of these solar panels that are probably putting out the most they could, that are in enough full sun to generate all that they can at that moment, and the rest of them have some reduced capacity due to the shade. So there are pros and cons to tracking systems. The largest con is moving parts that you've got to maintain. This in particular one, it breaks down on a semi-regular basis and needs fixed. Hopefully not major issues, but just stuff that you've got to work on. Yet it does produce more than if it was a system that just was stationary at this location, because it does track the sun and gain some benefit. We'll talk about the details of that benefit in a minute. We mentioned tilt. We're going to get into the details of tilt in a couple of slides here, but Temperature is also another influence on solar, where if you look at a spec sheet on solar, it will give a temperature coefficient for voltage and power and current. And in particular, you'll note that if you can interpret that coefficient, it's that as we increase cell temperature, we decrease power. So they are less efficient as they get warmer. Now this, luckily, it's not a huge amount, but it is something that when we model, we take into account, whether it's on a roof or out in the open. Because if it's on this roof on the right here, it's going to get warmer than if it's out in the open where there's a lot more airflow. And so they're going to take that into account, and it's going to produce less for the same size and tilt, slightly less. Also, cold temperatures, they're more efficient. So if we had an ideal world, we'd put a solar panel in a cold place that got perfect sun, but those two things don't always go together, right? Peak production tends to be in the summer because not only is sunlight intensity high, but also the number of hours is high. So this isn't necessarily to say that you should choose one over another. It's just so that we need to recognize that whatever system we put in place, we can model it and try to do our best job of estimating production by what it actually, how it's built. We can take that into account. The one on the bottom right is an older system where they actually changed the tilt of the solar panels. In modern times, I really don't like that because of the added cost and wind load for the added racking. I would prefer just to leave it at the pitch of the roof. And if you need more production, add a few more solar panels, because that's going to be probably a lower cost and more functional option than trying to change the tilt. They were trying to, this is back in the day when solar panels were pretty expensive, and they were trying to optimize production as much as they could. I prefer the style like on the top where they're the same pitch as the roof. For simplicity, reduced wind loading, reduced cost of racking, things like that. Solar panels do degrade over time. They sit in the sun, and the sun beats down on them and degrades the materials and things like that. And the solar industry has come up with kind of some definitions of what is acceptable degradation. And they say they have kind of decided that a solar panel is, I don't know, you'd say worn out when it has degraded 20%, or it's putting out 80% of what it did when it was brand new under standard test conditions. And so they have built solar panels that generally meet or exceed that degradation level of 20% or 80% after 25 years. So 25 years, they're going to degrade to 80% of what they were when they're new, and then they warranty based on that. So if they degrade faster than that, they theoretically could be warrantied out. You could, but it's, again, that's where it takes some panel level monitoring and other things to be able to recognize that. This is a large list of solar panel manufacturers, and you can see that all of these on this list are at the lowest 80% degradation, which is their warranty. At 25 years, it will degrade by 80% for this one. There are some that are quite a bit better than that. So this one is 87% and some over 90%. So 90 means that they produce 90% of what they did when they were brand new when they're 25 years old. So they only degraded about 10%. But I will tell you that it's very likely that these ones are probably higher priced. So you want to kind of balance those two, the price of the solar panel versus this degradation factor. This is where Eric, when he was modeling, said, we're going to leave it at 0.05%, which is this 80% value, unless we know differently. So if I was buying this LG panel and I read on the spec sheet that it has that its degradation factor is 0.037%, I would change that in the modeling, but only if I know exactly which solar panel I'm purchasing. If I don't know that, that's where we tend to model at the worst case scenario, which is the 80% factor. And I don't think, that doesn't mean a solar panel is bad at 25 years. A solar panel could last 30, 35, but it's just going to keep degrading. And and there, that's where we have to decide on what is our timeline. I was at a person's house the other day that had a solar panel that was put up in 1983. So that's 38 years ago, and or something like that. And that's and they're still producing. They're not doing great, but they're still producing.
John,
Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
just quick thought. This is like, that's good discussion, and that's a good opportunity to kind of just talk about at a high level what we're trying to accomplish when we're evaluating projects and when we're modeling projects. You know, and you know, as our friend Paul from NREL has always said, garbage in, garbage out when you're looking at models, right? It's not a crystal ball. And so you can change that degradation one way or another to make it say whatever you want. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to accomplish with the modeling is, you know, based on the information we have, what's the most likely outcome? Like what's most likely to happen, and model it based off of that. So, you know, your comment about, you know, we tend to look at the worst case scenario is one where at the end of the day, we're estimating based on what we know, what's most likely to happen. And so that's just one thing to kind of keep in mind with all of these inputs as we think about these different trigger points and different variables in the project analysis and how they fit into the model.
That's an excellent addition. Thank you, Eric. Knowing exactly which solar panel you're going to use may be less important in the economic modeling. It's important in the design, but not in necessarily the economic modeling, because we can estimate production based on some general factors. But orientation and tilt, and sometimes I say azimuth, or the direction it faces, and tilt are really important. So this is just an example where we modeled a 10 kW system that faces east on a 412 pitch roof, which is about 20-degree tilt. And then we compared that to, actually this suggests 18 for a 412 pitch, which is about right. I just rounded it to 20. This same system is going to produce 13% less than if we put that system as a ground mount facing due south at more of an optimum tilt for the location that it's at. 40 degrees would be optimum for about the 40-degree north latitude region. As you go farther north, that number goes up. As you go south, it goes down, but for optimum. But so 13% less. Does that mean don't put it on east-facing roof? Not necessarily. Just recognize that you're going to get loss. So let's look at this in good detail. What I did is I modeled a system in Lincoln, Nebraska, because that's where I am. And I did it at every azimuth,
John,
at every directional facing. Yes, Eric, what's the question?
Before you jump into this discussion, real quick comment on the last slide. So for a roof mounted system, is the age of the roof considered? I think that's worth talking to the whole group about.
Yeah, before install, it definitely is considered. You definitely want to consider if my roof, how long is my roof going to last, or the plan for it to last before I put it on. Because if you've got a roof that's 25 years old, you don't necessarily want to put solar on that roof and then have to, in 10 years, if let's say life of a roof is 35, it could be different for each roof, but if you only expect it to last 10 more years, then you're going to need to take that solar back off to tear the roof off and put a new roof back on. So it's good to kind of coincide that with either a roof replacement or a roof that's in very good shape. And so that's kind of an important consideration. Jim asked if you can mount the solar panels at the same pitch as the roof, or can you increase the pitch of the panels? Yes, you can increase the pitch of the panels, but you're adding obviously more racking structure to do that. And I feel like, and this slide that I'm on, I'm going to try to convince you to not do that, right? And so here's my attempt at that. So I modeled it with azimuth on the top row and tilt on the left-hand side, and I said, what is the maximum production? And that is, if that is at facing due south at about a 38-degree tilt, that is optimum right there. That was the largest factor. Now the others are 100 for meaning 100%, but they rounded to 100 for this particular chart. And so although that is optimum, if I were to put that at a roof pitch of 412, I'm somewhere in here. Yes, I lost 5%, but what did it cost me to save that 5%? It cost me money in racking, in wind loading, and things like that. And I'm suggesting it may be worth it just to add another solar panel rather than to get that extra, to regain that total production rather than try to mess with a different rack. And so you have that, but then you also have the azimuth or the direction it faces. And so the second chart is anything within essentially 5 or 6% of 100. And so you see there is some kind of wiggle room. Does it have to be exactly optimum at 38, or could it be a 42-degree pitch? Well, it could be 42. You're within 0.5%. It's no problem. Optimum, and you can see that there's actually more space on the tilt. It's less sensitive on the tilt than it is on the azimuth. The azimuth is a little more sensitive. I lose production quicker when I start changing it to different angles. I modeled a system the other day for a person's farm, and they had a roof that on a barn that was facing southwest, and so it was facing southwest at about 239 degrees, somewhere in here, and so they're going to get 90% of what they could if it faced due south, and it had a 412 pitch roof. Is that necessarily bad? We don't know, but what we do is we're going to model it, and then we can also model maybe a ground mount that would be more optimum and compare those two and see if our economic analysis is different, and see which is maybe more valuable to them. And so they could decide whether they're going to put that on that roof or come back and put it on the ground, or not at all. But so this is where the tilt and the azimuth do make a difference, but I would suggest that tilt is less sensitive than the azimuth. So you want to be closer due south to make it optimum. And then you want to be within about 10 degrees of 10, maybe 15 degrees of optimum. So if optimum is 40 and you're within about 15 degrees, so, you know, to get within about 1 or 2% of the optimum, so it'll work out pretty well. So just kind of some understanding of what's going on. You can model these numbers in the system. I'll teach you how to generate these numbers if you want to create something like this for your location on Thursday of next week. So there is some ways to generate these numbers. I created this chart from the generated numbers, but I can easily create the numbers themselves in that model. So. All right, I'm about done here, but this is looking at it from just the tilt rather than looking at it from the azimuth. I'm assuming we're going to face these south, and you can see though that the tilt isn't all that sensitive. You know, it's right up here, and if you're within fairly close to that optimum, it's going to be okay as long as you're facing south. But really, this chart is about these two on the right. One axis tracking is a system that faces east in the morning to get the morning sun. And then as the sun passes across the sky, it simply tilts, and it'll be flat at noon, and it'll tilt to the west in the evening. And so it's just tracking on one axis, on one pivot point. But we're gaining fairly significant production from that one axis tracking. Again, we can determine if that's valuable for your location. Most large wind farm or solar farms, large solar farms are putting in one axis tracking today. That's their model, and it works pretty well. It's reasonably simple, not a lot of moving parts. Those parts do break down. Every time I drive by a solar array with one axis tracking, almost every time, there's one of the rows that is kind of not the same angle as everybody else because something's not quite right with it. So there's kind of some ongoing maintenance that takes place. It's not real difficult, but there's ongoing maintenance. But they're gaining that extra production. Two axis tracking does better, but is even more complex and even more cost with respect to materials. And that 2-axis tracking, remember, it's harder to make big systems with 2-axis tracking because then your tracking systems get very large. So for behind the meter systems, I prefer fixed systems that are fixed in place and don't move because I want to minimize my maintenance. And as you get bigger, going to 1-axis tracking, and I pretty much like to avoid 2-axis tracking because everyone I've seen put up, they break down and people don't have the time to fix them. Can panels be heated to melt the snow and ice? The local solar farm was covered with snow for at least 3 days. I've never seen it. I've never seen anything be heated in that way. So I would say this is probably not a very good option from a cost scenario. Theoretically, those things are all possible. One of the things about solar that we have to remember is that obviously they're absorbing a lot of sunlight because they're dark in color, and they are going to gain some heat from the sun and melt snow off faster than other things. But if the snow is deep enough on the solar panel and it's very cold, it can take days, if not weeks, to melt that snow off. The biggest snow issue that I've seen is that solar arrays that are more flat tend to hold snow much longer than solar arrays that are at more of an optimum tilt angle of 35, 40 degrees. Remember, in my region, 35, 40 degrees is optimum. They will melt snow off much faster because of that larger tilt where that snow will slide off. So no, I've never seen it any heating system. I also would avoid, as crazy as it sounds, I would avoid cleaning the snow off unless they're very accessible. Don't get out your ladder. Don't climb out on your roof. Just let the snow melt. I know it's frustrating. It's frustrating to me. I lost 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks this winter to snow for my solar, but it's not safe to climb up and mess with that stuff. Just let it melt. Yeah, solar taking over farmland is going to be an ongoing question mark, but it's just one of those things that's happening, and I don't blame either side for that. I don't blame people arguing that solar we're losing good ag land, and I also don't blame the landowners that lease it because they're gaining a guaranteed income that they may or may not have from that land. So it's an interesting kind of conundrum with that. I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to stop sharing, turn it over to Eric to work on system cost.
Thanks, John. And just kind of a note on that comment. It's important to remember that with this workshop, we're really focused on behind the meter systems, not necessarily the utility scale projects that are kind of leading that debate right now. All right, does my screen show properly, John?
Looks good, Eric.
Perfect. All right, so yeah, John gets to talk about the fun stuff, the technology, the design, and all that, and then I'm going to spend the second half of today talking about numbers and financial metrics. So hopefully we can keep everybody awake for the next 40 minutes here. But I do think that this is a really important part of the overall project analysis. I'm always amazed when I'm talking with farmers, and they really get excited about this stuff because it's, at the end of the day, I mean, the idea that you can put a solar project up on the rooftop of your hog barn or your dairy farm and offset a large portion of your electric bill is pretty exciting. But I'll sometimes ask a simple question, at least it's simple to me, and I'm always amazed at how difficult it is for people to answer. A lot of times I'll hear feedback like, well, it's going to pay back in 3 years, or it's going to pay back in 6 years. And I'll say, well, how much is it? And what are you paying for? And those seem like pretty simple questions, but it's always amazing how hard it is sometimes for that to be answered. I think back to Tuesday when John was discussing how, some proposals are, very transparent and put together well and kind of telling you what they do and don't include, where others are maybe a little more difficult to understand. And that's where I think this section will help if we can really try to kind of assess the system cost and understand what it is that we're paying for. At the end of the day, it's really important to understand, what are you paying for in terms of system features? So not all solar systems are created equal. I think John's done a pretty good job of illustrating that based on different technologies, different design aspects. So what features are included in your project, and how much are you paying for it? So this is kind of an example. And again, isn't this really a no-brainer decision? It's a 3-year payback period, right? But we have to look a lot closer than that. And I think that this is an example. It's a couple years dated now, but this is a proposal a farmer had brought to me and asked if we could do some modeling to look at these numbers. And initially, what they really try to focus on, at least with this proposal, was this top summary box. So your net system cost of 19,000 and our break-even points 2.6 years. And so that is part of the challenge right off the bat. Is that's appealing because, well, you have all these different tax credits and depreciation and these different benefits that get you to this net project cost, but those are after the fact transactions. And it's important to remember, I guess important in my opinion, to ask the question, what's the number I need to write on the check? And so in this example, you can see the actual project cost is $212,500. And so there's a big difference there between this gross system cost and the net system cost. And as a general rule of thumb, the larger that gap, the more assumptions that are being made on some of your incentives and tax credits and energy savings. We talked about energy escalation rates, the value of a unit of energy that you're generating. Those are all things that are going to ultimately influence some of that information. So you see the other arrow up here, kind of looking at this 50 kW. I always encourage folks to start with this. What's the gross system cost? What's the size of the system? And start to look at this from a perspective of what is an installed cost per DC watt. And that allows you to, at least from a cost standpoint, accurately evaluate multiple proposals. So if you have 2 or 3 proposals, you can see, okay, what am I paying for? And if you kind of work that math out, you can see this system is at $4.25 per DC watt. So unless you're someone who is involved with solar and you're looking at this stuff kind of on a daily basis, a system cost of $4.25 per DC watt probably doesn't tell you a whole lot. And so I'd like to walk through a little bit here and look at what goes into that $4.25. Is that $4.25 in line with what we're seeing today, and kind of where the pricing trends are going? So this is a slide that kind of shares a couple of real life examples. These are a couple of farms I've worked with, and it's kind of a nice unintentional case study. These 2 projects were installed in the same county, on the same utilities distribution line, so same net metering rules, by the same installer. So really the only variable here is time. I mean, one system's larger than the other, but whether it's a 50 kW or 100, I would classify both of those as a nice mid-sized commercial system. But you can see in 2010, the installed cost per DC watt was $5.98 compared to the project in 2016, which was at $1.85. I will say that $1.85 back in 2016 was a little bit low compared to what some other stuff was going in at. I'd say $2.20 to $2.50 was probably a little more common. But nonetheless, it gives you a sense of where the price trends are heading. If you really kind of look at the bullets there, you'll notice that the payback period on the project that cost more is actually great, a better payback period. And the reason for that is there was additional state level grants that were available at the time, and then also the value of solar renewable energy credits in 2010 here in Ohio was significantly more than what they were in 2016. So just a little bit of a reminder, and we'll look at this more next Tuesday, that, incentives still play a major role in, in the financial performance of these projects. So that was a couple real life examples. Here's a chart from the Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Laboratory. They do a really good job of putting out quarterly benchmark reports for solar cost. They analyze this for both residential sectors, commercial, and then also utility scale. This chart's comparing, or I guess showing both the trends for residential PV systems. You can see there on the left, and commercial PV systems on the right. In general, you can see the the cost reductions for the commercial projects dropped by roughly 69% from $5.57 per DC watt down to $1.72 in 2020. And so, again, I'd mentioned that the real life examples were fairly close, and I'm always kind of interested and surprised, frankly, at how accurate the NREL data is compared to quotes that I tend to see from farmers here in Ohio. So I place a lot of value in these reports that they put out, and so anyone that's interested in that, certainly encourage you to search the NREL solar cost benchmark reports, and I can also send that information out if you're interested. And I guess one more piece on these numbers, because we're going to spend a few slides diving into them a little deeper. These numbers represent the cost paid to the final cost for the project paid to the developer. So this includes, everything from the net profit that's built into the equipment and the components to all of your soft cost. It's essentially representing the flip the switch cost of these projects being installed and operating. So I wanted to kind of look at this and start to have a little bit of a spending allocation for the total overall installation cost. So this pie chart's looking at the total cost of a commercial PV system installed in 2018, and of the $1.80, I think it was $1.88 per DC watt, what was that money going towards? And so you can see that, just over 56% of the total installation cost is tied to soft cost. So overhead, installation labor, net profit, interconnection, permitting, sales tax, contingency, those types of things. So the equipment components themselves are less than half of that $1.88. That's not always been the case, as we'll see in the next few slides, but the modules themselves account for roughly a quarter of the installation cost, whereas as you see the abbreviations here, the BOSS, electrical and structural, that's balance of systems. So balance of systems electrical would be wiring, connectors, combiner boxes, disconnects, those types of components, whereas your structural components would be more of the racking. Steel post into the ground, aluminum racking systems, fasteners, those types of things. And just kind of a note that, again, this is for a commercial system. These allocation breakdowns are slightly different from sector to sector. So residential and commercial are pretty close, but as you get into utility scale projects, the soft costs tend to represent a smaller portion of the overall installation compared to commercial. So just kind of a FYI. So we're going to look at each of those different cost components and kind of look at the trends and again, which gives you a sense of where we're heading. So if someone comes to you and says, hey, we'll install the project at $2.10 per DC watt, in the back of your mind, you can kind of have a sense of what you're paying for. This image is showing the global distribution supply chain for silicon PV module production. And it's a little bit, there's a lot of information here, a lot going on, but essentially it's categorizing polysilicon production, your wafer, you can see here the wafers, the cells themselves, and the modules. So this would be kind of your integrated supply chain for that PV modules, looking at the US, starting with the polysilicon, and then purple would be your wafers, blue would be the cell production, and then the yellow would be the actual assembly of the module itself. And, as you can see, in 2017, polysilicon production was dominated by China, and to a lesser extent, the U.S. and Germany and South Korea. If you look over here on the right hand side, these pie charts, they kind of break down each portion of that supply chain. So wafer capacity, cell capacity, module by region. And so, blue is representing China and Taiwan. Purple is the US. And so you can see we have 12% of the polysilicon capacity production globally. But then as we go through the wafer and cell capacities at 1%, module capacities at 1%, very little actual production taking place in the US compared to, when you compare it to the global supply chain. So this is kind of taking that chart and putting the assembly cost to those modules by country. And so when we think about a solar module consisting of 26% of the overall installation cost, this is representing what portion of that module cost is towards your total install cost based on what country they would be coming from. So again, as you can see, the US and Germany are a little bit higher. China is at 37 cents per DC watt. And this is kind of an interesting dynamic as you read this report. It talks about how there's actually a transition even within China from production in urban China to lower cost portions in rural China, where there's access to cheaper energy prices. And so I find that interesting that, we're looking for, as you look at how do you lower the cost of solar module production, it's access to cheaper energy markets, which and rural China is often some of the coal fire generators that they have over there. So kind of an interesting dynamic as we think about the energy mix and where it comes from and how it all impacts one another. So kind of bringing this back to the US, this is a line chart that's plotting out your module prices in the US from 2016 to 2020. And as you can see, we've seen some steady decrease from over that time period. What's really kind of mind-blowing is when we look at this from a 10-year perspective. And so if you look at, and it's not illustrated on the chart here because it's just off the chart. If you look at in 2010, our module cost were $2.23 per DC watt, compared to, third quarter of 2020, we're at 19 cents per DC watt. So, major reductions in module cost over the last decade. And that's really one of the reasons that we've seen the overall installation costs come down so rapidly. And in 2018 here is, I highlight that with an arrow because a lot of people have interest in this, the Section 201 solar tariffs. And I think this really ties into a couple of the previous slides, right? So obviously we want to make sure that we have, as we think about energy, right? It's not just price, it's reliability, it's energy security. And so we want to make sure that we're developing supply chains to produce these technologies as well. And so Section 201, the solar tariffs, they imposed a 4-year tariff on importing solar modules, and it's declining annually at 5%. So initially it was a 30% tariff. In 2019, it dropped to 25%, 2020, and so forth. So as you can see, while the import tariffs obviously are going to increase the cost, I think it's fair to say that if those tariffs were not in place, that these costs would be even lower based on the global supply chain map that we just looked at and what the costs are for some of these other regions to produce these modules. But with that said, we've still seen declining cost in operating within that solar tariff environment. So the idea is to promote domestic production, but at the same time, we want to continue to see the cost come down. So looking at the kind of rounding out some of the other technologies, and we don't need to spend as much time on these slides, but from 2010 to 2018, inverters, the installation costs represented by inverters dropped by 75%. Again, as we reflect back to our initial chart, that accounted for 4% of the overall installation cost. Inverters are, as John mentioned, not necessarily a one size fits all. And that goes back to my comment earlier about you need to understand what you're paying for. One system may cost more than another, but maybe they're using DC optimizers or string inverters compared to, micro inverters or DC optimizers compared to a string inverter. And that's obviously going to impact the price. These are 2016 numbers, so that's the most current that I could get to make this comparison. But you can see on that last chart, what was represented would be this 3-phase commercial string inverter at 13 cents per DC watt. And if we reflected on that last slide in 2016, that's right about where the costs were. Comparing it to the other technologies, obviously your single phase residential inverter is a little bit more expensive, but as we look at micro inverters, they're significantly more expensive. But John's mentioned some of the benefits, whether it's shading or panel level monitoring, meets Article 690.12 with the rapid shutdown standard. So a number of different features that you're paying for. But that goes back to the idea of when you're evaluating a proposal, making sure that you're talking with the installer so that they're selling you on the system. Why is their system, maybe better than a competitor's? Understand what you're buying. As we think about utility scale central inverters, that really doesn't apply for this audience, but the DC optimizers, just a note there, while they're a little bit more expensive here, it is a little more labor intensive to install. And so, I'd suggest that this doesn't fully represent how much more expensive DC optimizers might be compared to a string inverter. So our electrical and structural balance of systems, I've kind of combined the two for this line chart. Between 2010 and 2018, we've seen a 58% reduction in cost. And, if we put those two together, 15% of the total project cost is allocated towards that. And then finally, our soft cost. And here you can see between 2010 and 2018, not as much of a drop. We've seen a reduction in soft cost of 33% over that time period. Again, the soft costs are including basically non-equipment components. So your installation and labor, permitting, interconnection fees, if tax is there, sales tax, engineering, net profit. So those are the kinds of costs that are lumped in under these soft costs. And so to just kind of reflect back to that initial pie chart and summarize, while soft costs represent 56% of the overall installation, their prices have reduced the least over the last 10 years. Their prices have come down 33%, whereas, modules have dropped by 91% since 2010. Inverter costs have come down 75% since 2010. So when we think about where a lot of the driving forces behind the installation costs coming down, a lot of it goes back to those equipment components and the reduction in costs that we've seen.
Let's talk about that for just a second, Eric. A question came in that is module quality relative to module costs? So do you get what you pay for? How would you answer that?
Yeah, and I would say yes. And so as you look at some of your high efficiency modules, you're going to pay more for that. And a lot of times I'll hear the question: what should I wait to do this until the module efficiency comes up? And to me, that's kind of a loaded question. We need to remember that solar cells efficiency is measuring how efficient is it at converting sunlight to electrical current. So John talked earlier about 4.5 peak sunlight hours a day. That's hitting a square meter of surface area. How efficient are we at converting that to electrical current? The thing that we need to remember is it's an efficiency of a source that's free. So the question to me goes back to, well, yeah, it would be nice to have more efficient cells or more efficient modules, but if it's going to cost significantly more to purchase that module, is that necessarily the right move for your home or farm or business? If you can buy a 18% efficient cell at a reduced cost, then again, that's probably the route that you would go, because at the end of the day, the efficiency is efficiency of a fuel source that's free.
Yeah, I'm gonna add to that, Eric, and I think it's a good comment. I also will say though that there are a lot of good modules out there that are on the kind of moderate price range. It's kind of like buying a luxury car versus your standard car from one of the big three auto manufacturers. You can get a perfectly fine car that's reliable and gets you where you want to go, but doesn't maybe have the efficiency or the power or something like that. And so there's reasons you might want those high efficiency modules, but in many cases that average one is fine. And so you can really kind of balance that on what you're looking for. And I think there are quite a lot of good modules out there that are kind of only moderate efficiency that'll do fine for you. And you don't need to spend the money on the extra high efficiency unless maybe space is limited. I will say for those technical people, when we look at the research studies, the empirical theoretical maximum efficiency of a single junction solar cell is about 33%. And they are selling high-end modules today that are in the 22% efficiency range and kind of average modules in the 16 to 18% efficiency range. I don't foresee, at least in single junction cells, getting a whole lot more efficient very fast, right? I can see maybe your standard module jumping up there into the 22s, but that high-end module getting it from 22 to 24.5, I don't think it's going to get much higher than that.
No, I agree, and I think that the next jump is going to be towards multi-junction cells and the efficiency gains that you see there. But it's also important to remember that there's different target markets for these different components, right? So as you're thinking about putting a system on your home or farm, the quality of the cell may not be as important as someone who's putting together and trying to gather financing for a multi-million-dollar project that's going to go in on thousands of acres. So some of that stuff is going to certainly drive those decisions as well.
While we're doing questions, let's do the next one, Eric. The next one is basically a similar question to about inverters. And then what role does the inverter play in cost efficiency? And then how much does the inverter cost versus efficiency vary? And I'll answer the second one, and then you can kind of try to take the first part. But inverter efficiency across all inverters is fairly high, somewhere between 96 and 98%. And there's not a lot of variation in efficiency. So really inverters are pretty highly efficient. And I really don't see a lot of difference. They all kind of fall in that range of 96 to 98% efficient. But I'll let Eric talk about, how does that the cost of that inverter play with that?
Well, and again, I think when you look at it, I mean, to me, inverters are interesting because they're the component that has a lot of potential for failure just because of what it's doing, right? And it's not talking down on inverters or inverter manufacturers. It's just it's a high stress part of the overall operation of that system. But at the end of the day, it's as we just looked at, it represents 4% of the overall project installation cost. So this is a very small piece of the pie. And I don't know that. I guess I would really look at inverters. One of the things that's interesting to me is as I see how it impacts the cost of upfront of a project, is we're starting to see the ability to possibly increase your inverter cost up front. and I mean that by the sense that there's extended warranties that are being offered with the inverters. To me, it's less about the technology of the inverter and more about the quality and the warranty that you can get to go with that, because then that allows you to accurately model your ongoing O&M cost. But up front, it's still only 4% of the overall installation cost. So from our inverter slide, where'd that go? In 2018, if you're paying $1.83 per DC watt for a project, only 8 cents of that is allocated towards an inverter. So very small piece of the pie. All right, I want to kind of keep moving here because we do have quite a few slides to get through. Other and ongoing system cost, just take a few minutes to kind of go through this. This is just kind of a bulleted list of some of the other things that we need to consider when we're modeling system cost. Cost of capital if you're borrowing it, sales tax, property tax, insurance, ongoing operations and maintenance. These are all things that individually are very small, but as we think about modeling in aggregate, they all add up. And so I want to talk about a few of those things in a little more detail. As we think about sales and property tax incentives, obviously this is a national audience. We have participants from multiple states. I'd encourage you to visit the database of state incentives for renewables and efficiencies, desire.usa.org site. And you can filter your state to start to see, do you have sales tax or property tax programs related to solar development? Last I did a spot check, there were 25 states that had some type of an incentive for sales tax and 36 that had some type of a property tax exemption program. I want to give a couple of examples about why this stuff is important. And as I think about sales tax and property tax, I mean, we could include that in today's portion as we talk about the cost. For those of you that do have programs, it really is an incentive as well as we think about how it influences the overall financials of your project. And so I just want to look at a couple different perspectives of sales tax. And so we're going to assume, and I've modeled this out for these different systems. We're going to look at a system, a 50 kW system, so a mid-sized system on a farm at $1.85 per DC watt. So our total project cost is around $92,500. In Michigan, they at this time, and this was actually 2019 when I ran this model, they did not have a sales tax incentive. And so, you look at their state sales tax rate. They didn't have a local sales tax, but their state sales tax was at 6%. And so their savings was none. They're going to have additional sales tax of $5,500 onto that $92,000 project cost. Comparing that to Ohio, we do have sales tax exemption both at the state and local level. And so, based on the tax rates where I was setting when I did that analysis, you could say that there was an incentive essentially of $6,700 that we were not adding to that overall project cost. The state of New York was a little bit unique because they did have an incentive program, but it was just at the state level. And so at the local level, there was still a sales tax being applied. And so they were kind of a mixture where they did have some local taxes that were being paid, but there was some tax savings at the state level. And then you can see kind of at the bottom how that impacts the overall installation cost per DC watt. So, it's an important thing to understand and research is sales tax a piece of your modeling as you move forward in your state. Property tax is another one that is really important as you think about how it's going to influence your financial metrics. I just kind of wanted to put a couple bullet points up on there with some of the key terms as it relates to property taxes. Obviously tax rates and assessment values, I mean, they're going to vary significantly, not only state to state, but county to county, township to township. And so this is something you really need to work with your local auditor on to understand the exact rates. But your tax rate are often referred to as the millage rate. It's something that a lot of people don't really think about or understand. So a mill is representing 1/1000th of a dollar. Another way to look at that is to say that a mill would represent $1 of taxes that you would pay for every $1,000 of assessed value. The assessment rate is just that. It's the percentage of that property value that's subject to the tax. And then your effective rate is pretty simple. It's a product of the two. It's your nominal tax rate times your assessment rate. It's going to give you the effective rate. I put together a table to kind of show a little example. So in the township I was working with a farmer on, their millage rate was 40.2. And so what that's saying is for every $1,000 of assessed value, you need to pay $40.20 of taxes. or we can convert that to 4.02%. Now the assessed rate in that township was 35%. And so you can see we can do some simple math. Our effective rate is a product of the two. Our effective tax rate would be 1.407. If we applied that to that 50 kW system that we said was $92,500, you can look at that and say, well, that's $1,300 a year in additional property taxes based on on that township having that property tax. You could break it down in kind of a per kW perspective and see, $26 per kilowatt annually for that 50 kW system. So it's really important to understand if property taxes are going to play a role in your project. And the one thing I'll say, and I came across this example at Farm Science Review a couple of years ago, is, I mean, obviously, policies are complex and they're fluid. They're constantly changing. I would really encourage you to locally reach out to someone at your tax office or your county auditors to understand how that's going to be applied. I was talking with a farmer from New York State, and he was telling me about his system and how he was just couldn't be more happy about the system and to talk about it. He had like a 9.5 or 10 kW system, and he was just thrilled with it. He said the net metering works beautifully. The technology is just amazing to see it sit there and generate electricity. My electric bills are going down. He said, but from a payback perspective, he's like, this project's probably never going to pay itself off. And he said, we didn't account for property tax. And he said, in New York, there is a property tax exemption for renewable energy projects. However, there's a clause in that legislation that offers local municipalities the ability to disallow that exemption. And his had done that, and he wasn't aware of it. And so essentially he told me that, his, I think his 10 kW project, his property taxes went up just over $400 a year based on that solar project. So really something to keep in mind. It's important that, again, when we're modeling garbage in, garbage out, we need to make sure that we're putting good data into the model. Insurance, I don't know that we need to spend a ton of time on this slide, other than just to recognize it's something you need to investigate. If you get a quote, there is the potential to model for it. As a general guide, John and I have always kind of used 1/4 to 0.5% of the total project's cost annually. I was actually doing some modeling for a poultry farmer who was also an insurance agent. And he was looking at putting a project on his barns. And he said that for class 1 coverage, they would typically look at $5 per $1,000 of coverage. So that's just another way of saying 0.5%. And so that's just kind of what I would recommend as you're doing the modeling, is in lieu of actually getting a quote, that's probably a good point to give you some type of an annual cost allocation for insurance. Operations and maintenance. One of the things with solar that you're going to often hear promoted, and honestly, it is a clear benefit of solar, is once it's installed, it just kind of sits there and works. I mean, there's no, obviously, if we have single axis trackers, there's some moving parts, but for many of these residential and commercial systems that are installed on fixed racking, there's no moving parts. They just sit there, collect the sun, and generate electricity. With that said, it'd be naive to think that a project's going to operate for 25 years and not have some type of maintenance that needs done. Here's just on the screen a couple of examples you can see with, frayed wiring. Had some critters kind of got into that inverter. It's tough to see, but they were chewing up some stuff underneath. A lot of track wiring anymore exposes stuff to UV sunlight, so you can get some cracked casings, water penetrations on the modules themselves. So different reasons that maintenance needs to be done. And so we need to make sure that as we're evaluating a project, we're accounting for some type of operations and maintenance or some type of a rainy day fund for when something needs fixed. This is a chart from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory's 2018 quarterly benchmark cost report. And they're putting, as you can see on the left-hand side of the chart, a operations and maintenance cost value at $1 per kW. Again, so it's based on the overall system size. And you can see that they have different values based on the type of system that we're looking at. I've done some modeling for a farm recently and just kind of captured the numbers to look at, because it's one thing to just say, well, for a commercial system, let's do $19 per kW. What does that mean? And that's one of the things that John and I kind of go back to with the modeling is look at the cash flow table and ask yourself, does that seem like a realistic expectation of what you're going to spend money on? So I compared two different projects. We did at the time, they were recommending $26 per kW for O&M. On a 30 kilowatt rooftop system that they were looking at, that would have added $780 a year to their cash flow table. And over the 25 years of the project would be $19,500. So mind you, the installation cost on that project was just over $55,000. So kind of put it in perspective, that's a lot of money. And so we lowered that to $15 per kW. And at that point, it was $450 annually, $11,250 over the 25-year project lifetime. So, we were just trying to kind of visualize, what do we think could go bad? And this is where we had the ability to get a little more detailed as we do our modeling. And as we look at, I should back up one slide. As you look at these color coded here, you can see it's what is the operations and maintenance cost going towards. Cleaning and vegetation management is a big portion as projects get larger and you have mowing and weed control and those types of things. But on these commercial residential systems, really inverters are a big piece of it. And so one of the things that John and I've kind of explored recently is looking at modeling separately a inverter replacement. So instead of using a higher annual number and saying, well, we think that it's going to be $15 to $20 per kW annually, John and I are suggesting, look, we can model lower dollar values on an annual basis. And then let's just assume in year 10 or a year 15, we have to replace an inverter. And so we can build that cost into the model, and we'll show you how to do that next Thursday. But this just kind of gives you an idea of how we could do that. And so for a string inverter, $300 per kW is a replacement cost. So that's not just the cost of the inverter, but the cost of the actual replacement, the cost of the work being done. So as an example, for a 5 kW system on your home, $1,500. So we could say in year 10, we're going to have a one-time cost of $1,500. And then we may model a lower O&M cost annually of, say, $5 to $8 annually. And then you can see what that cost would be for a 50 kW system for a larger system. So just a different way to think about how we allocate cost. And instead of just assuming it's going to be a high number over the lifetime, we're going to say, you know what, year to year, you're not going to do that much, but you're probably going to have to replace some major components at some point. And that also is going to influence the metrics of that project as you think about the cash flow table, because it's influencing the time value of money as well, which is kind of a good transition into our final set of slides here, where I want to share a couple of different financial metrics and maybe highlight some strengths and weaknesses. This session here is not necessarily geared towards making you a financial advisor, but I do think it's important that we spend a little bit of time talking about time value of money and how that influences different financial metrics that we could use to evaluate these projects. And again, we kind of go back to that idea of, well, is this really a no-brainer decision? It's a 2.5-year payback. And I think that we're asking ourselves the wrong questions there. A simple payback, while it's a valuable metric, is just kind of looking at one piece of the pie. And so I always encourage people to, really use multiple financial metrics and kind of use them in conjunction with one another, because they all have different strengths and they're all telling us something a little bit differently. 1 second here, John.
One of the things that, as he's working on that, that I'll mention is I've seen a number of maintenance issues over the years. Some have been different, the faults of different people. We broke a ground mount solar panel or two when we drove a shredder too close to it. I've seen mice chew on wires on ground mount. Not an expensive fix, but a fix that needed. I've replaced a number of inverters under warranty. I say a number, not a large percentage, but a few. I've seen owners crack solar panels when they're clearing off snow. I've seen vandalism. I've also seen hail, but the hail, I will tell you, it's the problems have really only been when there's very extreme hail. Normal hail conditions where the size of the hail is under a golf ball, I've never seen a problem with. It's just when they get really big, I've seen some destruction of solar panels. But just kind of fun to list some of the things that we've seen over time.
I'm back, John. Thanks. So, excuse me. So, why are solar projects so difficult to evaluate? As we think about it, it's not like purchasing a piece of equipment for your business or for your farm. There's a lot of variable factors that go into that. So, obviously, financial performance is tied to actual energy production. So the performance of the system in producing energy. Operations and maintenance costs are variable costs. Inconsistent revenue streams as you throw in different, tax programs, incentive tax, investment tax credit programs, solar renewable energy credits, depreciations. There's just very unique revenue streams that come from these projects. Energy savings, as we think of energy escalation rates, is going to impact the value of the energy that you're modeling. And then the rate structures themselves, and whether you're compensated at the full retail rate for a unit of energy, or whether you're compensated at just the generation component at avoided cost. These are all things that will influence these projects. And so, in summary, kind of that analysis period is a long-term period. We typically model these on 25-year life cycles because it mirrors the warranties on the modules themselves. And as we think about that long-term period, we have to recognize the time value of money. And so we're going to kind of take a few minutes to talk about the time value of money, and then how that's going to impact some of our various financial metrics. So first thing I want to talk about is inflation, and we're going to kind of look at an example of this through the perspective of a cheeseburger. But in general, inflation's the rate that the price of goods or services is going to rise over time, and so consequently, as the cost of those price and goods go up, it decreases the purchasing power of the currency. What we can do is, as I mentioned, looking at this from a perspective of a cheeseburger. Now, these are receipts from, these are Canadian dollars, so just kind of note that. But we can compare, exact McDonald's receipt: quarter pounder with cheese, 2 large fries, chocolate shake, 2017 compared to 1998. You can see, basically $7 compared to $16.26. And so what that's representing, again, is the consequential rise of the price of goods and services over time. This is kind of a chart looking at 2000 through 2018 of the Consumer Price Index. Now, note this is for all goods. So, but in general, from 2020 to 2019, we've seen an average U.S. inflation rate of 2.19%. And so, it's important to think about these things as we build it into our model, because it's one of the things that's going to influence us over the next 25 years when we look about the cash receipts that we could expect. Of course, you can see the dramatic dip there in 2008, and that's when we had recession and subprime mortgage crisis and automotive bailouts and all kinds of stuff going on there. So, shows up in the data for sure. So, quick example in terms of why the time value of money is important. just want to kind of assume, and I think we could put a poll up there to do this example if we wanted to, but we'll just assume that you guys all drew a winning lottery ticket, right? So $100,000. You have two options. You could take the pile of cash right now, today, one-time payment, or option two, you can draw $4,000 annually for the next 25 years. So the question is, do you want money up front or do you want to wait to get that money? I would assume that if we did the poll, most of you would say, yeah, I'll take the money right now. And the reason for that money has more potential now because you could invest it. You can put it to work for you. Whether that earns 3, 4, 5%, the ability that you would have to invest that money and generate a return has additional value. So if you invest that 100,000 and you earn 5% over the next 5 years, you'd be sitting on just over $127,000 versus if you were drawing on that slowly over time. And so the time value of money is again, the concept that money available at present time is worth more than an identical sum that you would get in the future because it has earning capacity. So as we think about present value, just as we could add earning capacity to money that we have in hand today to estimate what that value would be in the future, we could take cash flows from future years and discount that to see, well, what's the value of that in present day terms? And so we would be applying what's referred to as a discount rate. And so that discount rate would essentially estimate, well, if I'm going to receive money in the future, what's it worth today? Because I'm spending money today to get that return in the future. It's a little bit of a confusing concept if you're not dealing with this stuff on a daily basis, but whether you're dealing in future value or present value, the key is consistency. The other key is as we talk about the modeling and we talk about net present value to measure this product or this project, is understanding how sensitive it is to the discount rate. And so the discount rate, again, is what we're discounting those future cash flows to represent a present value. People look at it, it's more of an art than a science. There's no right or wrong answer to selecting, well, what is the proper discount rate? Some people might look at that as the cost of capital. Some people might look at it as the rate of return needed to get outside investments for that project. Some may use it to compare against an alternative project or an alternative investment. So if you're going to receive a certain return on an investment A, well, then we need to see how this project would perform under those same conditions. So while there's no right or wrong way to come up with that, I think it's important to understand that your cash flows as you look at these projects are going to be sensitive to whatever it is that you select. Now, the model is going to automatically default. I think right now they're at 6% or 6.4%. They adjust that over time based on what activity they're seeing in the solar market. So I think that it's a good starting point. One thing to keep in mind as you look at the SAM model as it applies to a discount rate is the real discount rate is going to be simply the discount rate that you would select for the project. Your nominal discount rate is going to be both your real discount rate plus inflation. And so, the sum of these two, your nominal discount rate, is going to be the value that ultimately impacts your cash flow tables. And I'll show an example here in a few slides in terms of how that discount rate is impacting those cash flows in future years. So as we're kind of driving here in the last few slides, I just wanted to take a minute and do a real high-level summary of the different financial metrics that the System Advisor model uses and what some of the strengths or weaknesses may be. And then we'll kind of look at an example of each of these moving forward. So as we think about the simple payback, simple payback is easy to calculate and it's easy to understand, right? So you think about, okay, I pay X amount of dollars, I get that money back in so many years. Simple math. The weakness is it doesn't account for time value of money. Your irregular cash flows over time. Your receipts are not always going to be equal annually. It's tough, difficult with long-term projects. You can't compare alternative investments. It's just kind of difficult to evaluate what happens after the payback. And then it's not recommended where you have complex financing, whether that's tax credits or grants over time. As we think about a discounted payback period, it's a very similar approach as the simple. However, it does account for all of the cash flows and considers the time value of money. A weakness is, as we just discussed in the last slide, is as we look at the time value of money, we have to recognize that there's a sensitivity to the discount rate that's selected. And so I would always recommend modeling a system at a couple of different discount rates to see how that influences your results. And then it doesn't look for what happens after the break-even point. Net present value is very similar to a discounted payback period, except it takes into account the total life cycle of the project. So it does account for all cash flows, time value of money. You can adjust it for risk based on adjusting that discount rate and how conservative or aggressive you want to be with future cash flows. And then it allows you to rank projects to clearly kind of compare one to the other. And then finally, the levelized cost of energy. This is a metric that combines fixed cost and variable cost into a measure that's pretty simple to think about. It's what is the cost per kilowatt hour. So it's an easy metric. It's easy to understand. It is difficult you can't necessarily use levelized cost of energy to compare across different types of generation, because there's a certain value. There's value in the fact that wind and solar are emission-free sources and renewable energy sources. However, on the other side of that, there's value to natural gas, coal, and nuclear from the perspective of it's a base load source that you can control, and you can ramp it up or slow it down as you need it. And so it's difficult to compare different technologies using the levelized cost of energy. So kind of jumping in and looking at a couple of examples. Simple payback is one that we don't necessarily calculate using the system advisor model. What we refer to in the system advisor model is the actual payback period. And to me, that's a little different than simple payback that I see some of our developers using. A simple payback calculation, they're looking at the cost of the project divided by the energy savings per year to see how many years can this pay back. An example of that was that proposal I shared with you earlier. They were using $19,000 as the system cost, which we looked at earlier. That was the net cost, right? That's the cost after all of the tax credits, the grants, the solar renewable energy credits. This isn't the number you're writing the check for, but this was the net cost, and they divided that by the annual estimated energy savings. And again, in this example, they used 11 cents per kilowatt hour. So they were assuming that every unit of energy you generated was worth 11 cents, which John and I will kind of describe next Tuesday, and then when we model on Thursday, how that's not always the case. But so we have a little bit of an inflated version of our energy savings, and then we've looked at this net cost instead of the gross cost that you're writing on the check, and you get 2.87 years. If you were to use the gross cost of that system, just as a refresher, was $212,500. So, if we use this same formula to calculate it based off of gross, it's a 32-year payback. Again, that's why I think it's important to look at different metrics, because obviously the strength of this is its simplicity. The weakness is it's difficult when you're looking at a long-term project with differing annual cash flows. So what SAM does is use what's referred to as the payback period. And so that the payback period, they do look at a cash flow table. So over the 25-year lifetime of the project, and they'll look at it and say, okay, based on our annual cash receipts, we had an initial cash outlay or project cost of $88,180. What year are we going to recover that? And you can see in this example, I have the arrow there. It's right around year 10, between 10 and 11, that they'll recover that money. Just to kind of point out here, up front, you see some larger cash receipts initially. Part of the reason for that is your investment tax credit program. Also, you're going to have makers model depreciation on the front end of the project that's going to contribute to that. And then also, if you had a solar renewable energy credits could influence that as well. So there's multiple reasons why you might see larger cash receipts on the front end versus the back end of that project. So if we take this one step further and say, okay, well, we recognize that this is better than simple payback, right? At least we're looking at annual cash flow to determine when that payback period is going to incur. And we're doing it based off of the actual amount that we write on a check. Let's discount these cash flows to say, well, we recognize that money we receive in future years is not the same, worth the same as money that we would have in hand today. So if we look at our non-adjusted cash flow table from this project, and again, this is a project I actually modeled. It was a 50 kW project. You can see, let's just pick a year. So year 20. So based on the revenue from our energy savings in year 20, we would be $4,560. But we recognize that we had to spend money upfront today. So that's money I cannot reinvest to have earning capacity for me, right? That 88,000 that we invested that was money with earning capacity. Well, now we've spent that. So we don't have the potential to earn from that. So we recognize that in year 20, because I have to wait to get that return, it's not worth the same amount. So we applied a 6% discount rate, and you can see in year 20, a discounted cash flow is going to say, well, that $4,500, if you have to wait 20 years to get it, it's really only worth $1,422. Again, the sensitivity of your time value of money is going to be influenced by this discount rate. So we can play with this a little to see, how it's going to influence our metrics. But looking at that, our break-even point all of a sudden is in year 19. So net present value is very similar to the discounted payback period, with the exception that it kind of looks at, well, what happens after the project pays for itself? And that's one of the beauties with net present value, is it's very easy to evaluate. If this net present value number is positive, it's probably a good project. If this net present value number is negative, obviously what that's saying is you're not going to reach that payback period during the life cycle of the project. So if this net present value number were negative, that's going to say, well, we've passed year 25 and I still haven't received my $88,180 back yet. So, in summary, positive's good, negative's bad. Once again, recognizing that discount rate is going to change these numbers. We could lower this discount rate to 3 or 4%, and the cash flows in future years here would increase from what you see in this column right now. So in summary, net present value, it's to me, it's my preferred metric as we look at these. Money now is more valuable than the money that we have to wait on. So we do need to recognize that and apply discount. Positive good, negative's bad. The final metric that we haven't talked about to this point is levelized cost of energy. We don't need to spend a lot of time on it, but that first bullet point is probably the most important. The levelized cost of energy, it's a little bit different from these other metrics because it is representing a per kilowatt hour cost of building and operating a power plant. So that's an important piece right there. It's representing a per kilowatt hour cost of building and operating a power plant. So what's missing from that formula, as you think about this, is the revenues, right? So when we think about how difficult it is to evaluate the cost of a unit of energy, how difficult it is to evaluate net metering rules and what you're compensated at different times, levelized cost of energy doesn't take that information into account. It's simply what is the cost to build it and what is the cost to operate it compared to what the lifetime production would be. And so what we do with that then is we'll look at that output, that cost per kilowatt hour, and compare that to other options. So what am I paying, what am I paying for my utility for a unit of energy versus what this system could produce it for? Recognizing that there is additional value from your utility because they can provide it when the sun's not shining. So you kind of have to take that with a grain of salt, but it kind of helps you recognize if you're paying 8, 9, 10 cents and your levelized cost of energy is 18, okay, that's probably a pretty tough investment. Again, I recommend, we're going to hand this off to John for a couple minutes of Google Jamboards, but I would really recommend not necessarily using one of those metrics, but I like using all 4 of them together to kind of help it paint a picture of the overall project and what it's telling us. If I did have to pick one, net present value would be my favorite. So the nice thing about these metrics, I think it's important to understand what they're telling us. But fortunately, because of the SAM model, we don't have to understand how to calculate them. The model does that for us as we build that. But I think as you look at that summary table of outputs, it helps to think about, okay, well, what does net present value mean? What's the difference between a payback period and a discounted payback period? And so that's kind of the point of this slide deck here is we get to next Thursday and we start to simulate some projects. Hopefully this will help you understand what it's telling you. And to me, it's much more important to understand those metrics versus a marketing brochure, a proposal that says, oh, it's a 3.5 year simple payback. Well, if under that scenario, who wouldn't do it? So with that, John, I'll hand it off to you for
the time we have, Eric, we're real short. So let's just go to questions. And if you'd go back about 3 slides to that net present value slide, I'll say something about that as we ask questions. And that will actually bring up, let's answer Cheryl's question, the process. She asks, how do you pick a proper discount rate? And again, Eric laid out a couple of different ways to pick that out. You could say, well, if I had another investment, what could I earn on that investment? And this investment should be at least that. That's one way to pick it. Another way to pick it would be to say, how risky is this investment? If I invest in the stock market and I can make an average of 6%, I plan, that could be my discount rate. But the reality is I could also pull that money out of the stock market with maybe a tax penalty, but I could pull it out. It's still fungible. Well, this investment is a fixed investment. I've stuck with it. And so I'm going to say, well, that's riskier to me. So I want a better return. So there are some people who might argue they should put a higher discount rate on this type of investment. But the discount rate is very unique to you. But I'm going to give an interpretation of the discount rate here on this slide that might help you think about it. The net present value, when the net present value is 0, or let's put it this way, I'm going to try to reword this in a way that'll help. The rate of return is equal to the discount rate when the net present value is equal to 0. So in this case, the net present value is positive, suggesting we made more than 6% on this investment. If the net present value was 0 in this example, whatever the discount rate was is equal to the rate of return. So let's say the net present value is equal to negative 1,000. That's not good if we're trying to compare investments, right? We're saying that this investment wasn't as good as some other investment. But it doesn't mean that you had a negative rate of return. It just means the rate of return was not 6%. It might have been 4%. And so that's just a way to look at that discount rate, is that when the net present value is 0, that's your rate. The discount rate is your rate of return. And so that's kind of just a different way to look at it, different way to explain it that may help you envision it.
John,
yeah, go ahead.
Maybe an easier way to think about that, looking at this chart. So let's just assume this was a 20-year project. So let's just assume that we looked at a 20-year analysis period. So everything under here just didn't exist. We were looking at a 20-year cash flow table. Our our net present value would essentially be zero, right? Like that's
Right.
that's one way to look at it. So you could say the internal rate of return on that project was 6%. That's kind of what you're trying to say, right?
That is what I'm trying to say, and a way to think about it, just a different way to explain net present value. So I appreciate that clarification. All right, I think we're done. We're not going to take any more of your time today. Thank you for joining us. We hope to see you on the next web seminars.